Good evening and welcome to another episode of Poetry Corner. Today we're looking at another figure of the Christian faith in the past, perhaps a less well-known one to many, and that's St. Anselm of Canterbury, a very important Archbishop of Canterbury shortly after the Norman conquest, so the early 11th century and into the 12th century AD. Don't worry, not everybody I look at is going to be somebody whose names begin with an A. It just worked out that way. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Anselm, about his life, about what he was like as a person, about some of the things he wrote and thought, and about what we can learn from him. So without further ado, let's look at Anselm of Canterbury. Now, Anselm of Canterbury, even though he's named after Canterbury, where he was Archbishop, didn't grow up in England, as it then was. He grew up actually in northern Italy, northwest Italy. But when he was a young man, he wanted to become a hermit, and his father wouldn't let him. His father was very strict, put Anselm into a bit of an illness. And later on, with his father's failing health, he left the region and travelled up into what's now France. Indeed, it was at the time the Kingdom of France, but it was largely ruled by semi-independent dukedoms. And he made his way up to Normandy, where he met an old countryman of his, Lanfranc, at the abbey at Bec. And Lanfranc persuaded Anselm to become a monk there. And to cut a very long story very short, Anselm became a monk there when he was 29, I think it was. Quite old, very late in the day for a monk. You normally became one when you were between 5 and 12 years old. But Anselm was a very successful monk. He loved being a monk. He really loved the community he had with the other monks. And he very quickly became well known as a scholar and as a writer. Lanfranc left the abbey to become Archbishop of Canterbury for William the Conqueror. He was the first archbishop after the Norman conquest, and Anselm took over the abbey at Bec, where he wrote a number of works. Again, cutting the story very short, when Lanfranc died and William II needed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, he picked on Anselm. And Anselm was allegedly very reluctant, and the English bishops had to mob him, pick him up and carry him into the cathedral to forcibly consecrate him archbishop, while he kicked and screamed and insisted he didn't want any of this. Something that it may well be many of our own bishops can relate to. It's not an easy task, especially if you're a very conscientious person, as Anselm was. But he was made Archbishop of Canterbury, and having been made Archbishop, he was a very conscientious prelate. He fought very hard for maintaining the rights of the church against the kings of England, who were often keen to make the church a subordinate organ of state. And Anselm, particularly amongst English archbishops, was determined that the church would not be an organ of politics, a part of the state, but would be independent, owing its allegiance only to God. He therefore clashed with several English monarchs over both the legal and financial independence of the church and over some of the things they got up to in their courts, monarchs being no better than they had to be even in those days. And in fact, Anselm was twice forced into exile, even having to suffer the terrible fate of living in France for a while, rather than backing down and cooperating with the monarch, with the government, the state of the time. Throughout all that, Anselm wrote, and a couple of his works, particularly one called Kurdish Hommer, of which more later, had a lasting impact. Anselm's legacy was a complicated one, but perhaps the two biggest elements of it were this: an English church that saw itself as, while it was involved in the governance of the country, independent and not under the control of the government. And secondly, he revitalized and refreshed the way Christians thought about the cross. So let me talk a little bit about that, because it's part of his writing. Anselm wrote a lot of books and treatises, but I'm only going to bore you with two of them. And the first is one called the Cross Logion, which you could sort of translate as the talking to. It's a bit of an imagined dialogue. And this was originally going to be titled Faith Seeking Understanding. For Anselm, as for other medieval Christians, faith and reason were not enemies, but codependent, colleagues, siblings. And they wrangled amicably about which one came first. But Anselm, like Augustine, thought that faith came first and was strengthened and developed by understanding. In our post-romantic movement, post-enlightenment age, where we tend to see faith and reason as rivals, I think that's an important and different perspective. For Anselm, reason and understanding and hard academic, intellectual, scholarly work was precisely the way to grow and develop your faith. Rather than the two being separate or at enmity, the two fed each other. And faith was the necessary foundation for doing good intellectual work. So the Cross Logion is all about trying to grow your faith through growing your understanding. And in particular, Anselm tries to convert or to have a dialogue with the fool. One of the Psalms says that the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And Anselm wants to explain why it is foolish to say there is no God and why there logically has to be a God. And quite intelligently, he says, if you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe there is a God, you might not have very much in common. So you have to make your argument from pure reason, not from assuming that the two of you agree on any facts about the world. Now that's perhaps a little ambitious, but this is the argument he comes up with. It's sometimes called the ontological argument for the existence of God. And the argument is this. 1. God is by definition the greatest being imaginable. That's what we mean when we talk about God, the greatest being imaginable. Point 2, for any being, it is greater to exist than not exist. The being that exists is greater than the being that does not exist. A real friend is better than an imaginary friend. If God didn't exist, point 3, then we would be able to imagine something even greater, namely a God who did exist. And therefore, the God who does not exist would not be God. God can only be God if he exists. Point 4, therefore, by definition, God must exist. Now, if your head's hurting a little bit at the moment, don't worry. So did mine when I was first introduced to this. It's often made an exercise, I believe, for first-year philosophy students to explain why it's wrong, because most philosophers believe that the argument doesn't in fact prove that God must by definition exist, largely because you can't say that something by definition exists, therefore it exists. Claiming that something is so by definition does not mean that it is so in fact. However, that's a digression. It's a flavour of Anselm's thought. Anselm was very logical in his reasoning, even as he was very warm and loving and friendly in his relationships. And if you ever get the chance to read his letters, they're embarrassingly effusive about how much he cared about his fellow monks and spiritual brethren. But much more influential than the Cross Logion is the Kurdish Hommer, which is a title that literally means, why God man? Or perhaps slightly more comprehensively, why did God become man? And Anselm wrote it when he was Archbishop of Canterbury, and he wanted to reach out to the Jews of York and the Jews of London, or big Jewish communities here in the Middle Ages. And that was one place in the country where there was a community that wasn't Christian. And Anselm wanted to have dialogue with the Jewish community and try and argue for why Christians believe in the incarnation, believe that God became man. Because in a way, most of the strange, messy, hard to understand and believe things about Christianity are about the incarnation. How can you have a Trinity, a God that is three and yet one? How can God be man and yet still God? How can God, who is the author of life, die? All this stuff is rooted in the incarnation. If you take the incarnation and the Trinity out of Christianity, you basically have Judaism or Islam. That's a massive oversimplification. But the incarnation is the tricky bit, the difficult bit of Christianity, and Anselm wanted to explain why it's also a necessary bit of Christianity, why God became man. And it's one of those questions where you feel you should take off your shoes because it's holy ground. But this is what Anselm argues. Again, it's a very simple logical argument in its way. It says that, point one, to wrong somebody is to incur a debt. If you hurt somebody, you owe it to them to make it up. If you do somebody an injustice, you have wronged them and, in a sense, incurred a debt to them. Point two, the greater the entity that you have wronged, the greater the debt. If you tread on an ant, that's a bit mean, but we don't view it as a really serious sin. Stamp on a squirrel, that's meaner. The crime is greater, and so Anselm would argue the debt incurred is greater because the thing that you have wronged is a higher order of being than an ant. If you'll pardon the rather ugly image, tread on a baby, and that's a lot worse still, because you wronged a human being, much more important than a squirrel, as a squirrel is more important than an ant. The greater the being you've wronged, the greater the offence and the greater the debt. Point three, Anselm says, man, humanity, has sinned against God, has wronged God, and God is infinitely great, infinitely good, infinitely valuable. Therefore, man has incurred an infinite debt. The problem is that the debt is man's, humanity's, and so it must be paid by humanity, but the debt is infinite. And man is finite. Man cannot pay an infinite debt. You're just about following so far. Humanity has wronged God and thus has incurred a debt because God is infinite. The debt is infinite because humanity is finite. They can't pay an infinite debt. Only God can pay an infinite debt. But the debt is incurred by humanity and so must be paid by humanity. Therefore, Anselm says, for the debt to be paid, for the justice of God to be satisfied, God must become man, so that man, humanity, can pay their debt, and God, the infinite, can pay the infinite debt. God, the infinite, has to become man, so as to pay the infinite debt of mankind to God. That's Anselm's argument for the incarnation. Now again, if it's making your head hurt, don't worry too much. It's medieval logic. But the key part of it was this, that it refocused our attention on the way in which at the cross Jesus was paying our debt, paying for us. The early Middle Ages tended to emphasize that aspect of the cross which was triumph, Jesus winning the victory and defeating evil. And that's an element of the message. It's an element that really appealed to that very military age. But Anselm reopened people's eyes to a very neglected part of the cross, which is Jesus paying for us, Jesus taking our place, Jesus paying our debt, so that as he dies he says, tetelestai, it is finished, or perhaps most literally, it is paid in full. That's a hugely important part of understanding what Jesus did for us on the cross and what it means to be Christians, those whose debt has been paid for us by somebody else, who no longer have to pay it for ourselves. That gives a great security, I think, to us as Christians, knowing that our debt is paid. It gives us a great reason to be grateful to God, who has paid for us the debt that we could not pay. And it should prevent us from feeling superior to others, because we know that we, too, could not save ourselves. We too were in a hopeless situation with a debt we could not pay when God paid it for us. So what can we learn from Anselm? Well, I think three things for me stand out from his life. The first is his warmth. This is somebody who had incredibly warm and close relationships with his Christian friends and colleagues. People who write about him write about what a kind, gentle, sensitive, loving person he was. But he combined his warmth with courage. This was somebody who was willing to look an absolute ruler in the eye and tell them no. This was somebody who was willing to stand up to the whole government and state of his day and say, no, you may be in charge of the country, but the church answers to God alone. Gentleness and warmth and courage are a rare and a precious combination. And to those two, he united a third quality, which was scholarship. He had a big brain and he used it. He used his understanding to grow faith, to grow the faith of others. It was a tremendously powerful combination, and I think key to his sainthood and his lasting influence. He was a man of warmth and kindness. He was a man of courage and strength. And he was a man of intellect who used his gifts in the service of God with warmth and with courage. Three precious gifts united. Three gifts that are strongest and best in union. I'm going to draw stumps there with Anselm. This video is long enough already. We have one more medieval figure to look at, and I'm afraid his name also begins with A. It's Aquinas. More on him next time, and then we'll get on to somebody else entirely. Somebody from England, and somebody a little closer to home. But next up, Aquinas. Come back next time for some more History Corner.